The Spencer estate, nestled on the outskirts of the affluent town of Crestwood, was a picture of opulence and refinement. Inside the grand mansion, Richard Spencer stood by the large window of his study, his sharp eyes fixed on the driveway. A sleek sports car roared up the drive, its arrival heralded by the pounding beat of music. Ethan, Richard's 25-year-old son, stumbled out of the car, his movements unsteady. He was flanked by a group of equally inebriated friends, their laughter loud and grating. Ethan's disheveled appearance and the smell of alcohol that wafted in through the open door were a stark contrast to the pristine order of the Spencer estate. Richard's jaw tightened as he watched his son. Ethan had all the potential to be a great leader, the heir to the family business, but his reckless behavior was jeopardizing everything Richard had worked so hard to build. The endless parties, the irresponsible spending, the frequent mentions in scandalous headlines, all of it was undermining the Spencer name and the future of their company. "Ethan!" Richard called out, his voice firm but controlled as he stepped into the hallway. Ethan looked up, a smirk playing on his lips, but there was a flash of annoyance in his eyes. "What now, Dad?" Ethan's tone was dismissive, his words slurred. "We need to talk," Richard replied, his gaze unwavering. Ethan rolled his eyes, turning to his friends. "You guys go ahead. I'll catch up later." He waved them off, then followed Richard into the study, albeit with a swagger that spoke of defiance more than compliance. In the distance, the laughter and chatter of Ethan's friends faded, leaving a heavy silence in the room. Richard closed the door behind them, the click echoing ominously. "Look at yourself, Ethan," Richard began, his voice tinged with frustration. "This isn't how an heir to the Spencer legacy behaves. You're throwing everything away." Ethan flopped into a chair, his eyes glinting with irritation. "And what exactly am I throwing away, Dad? A life chained to a desk, buried in paperwork." Richard's gaze hardened. "A life of responsibility, of leading a company that hundreds of people rely on for their livelihoods. A legacy that has been built over generations." Ethan scoffed, leaning back with a careless grin. "Sounds thrilling," Richard sighed, the weight of disappointment heavy on his shoulders. He turned to look out the window again, seeking a moment of clarity. In the garden, Emily Thompson moved among the flowers, her hands deftly tending to the plants. The young gardener's dedication and quiet determination stood in stark contrast to Ethan's careless attitude. Emily had only been with them for a month, but her presence had already made a noticeable difference in the garden. She worked with a diligence and pride that Richard couldn't help but admire. Watching her now, he felt a pang of regret, a wish that Ethan could see the value in hard work and responsibility as Emily did. "What are you staring at?" Ethan's voice cut through his thoughts. Richard turned back to his son, a new resolve hardening within him. "Ethan, I'm going to make this clear. Your behavior has consequences. If you don't start taking your responsibilities seriously, there will be changes." Ethan's smile faded slightly, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. "Changes? What kind of changes?" Richard met his gaze, his voice firm. "You'll see soon enough. But mark my words, Ethan. You won't be able to live this way forever. It's time to grow up." Ethan stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "You can't control my life, Dad. I'm not a child." Richard's eyes narrowed. "Then stop acting like one." With a final glare, Ethan stormed out of the study, slamming the door behind him. Richard stood there for a moment, the silence heavy around him. He knew he had to take drastic measures to save his son from his own self-destructive path. His gaze drifted back to the window, to Emily, working tirelessly in the garden. An idea began to form in his mind, a bold, perhaps unconventional, but necessary plan. It was time to make Ethan understand the value of responsibility and hard work. And maybe, just maybe, Emily Thompson could help him do that. Richard turned away from the window, a determined look on his face. The wheels of change were already in motion, and there was no turning back now. Richard Spencer stood by the large window of his study, his eyes drawn once again to the garden below. The morning sun bathed the flowers in a soft, golden light, and amidst the vibrant blooms, Emily Thompson worked diligently. Her brown hair, tied back in a neat ponytail, swung gently as she moved. She was meticulously trimming the hedges, her concentration evident in every precise cut. Richard observed her for several minutes, noting how she interacted with the other staff. Her demeanor was always respectful, her instructions clear but kind. She carried herself with a quiet confidence and humility that set her apart. Unlike many who worked on the estate, Emily seemed genuinely invested in her work, taking pride in every task she undertook. As he watched her, an idea began to take shape in Richard's mind. It was bold, perhaps even unconventional, but desperate times called for desperate measures. He needed to save his son, Ethan, from the reckless path he was on. And maybe, just maybe, Emily could help him do that. With a deep breath, Richard left his study and made his way to the garden. Emily looked up as he approached, a hint of surprise in her eyes. She quickly set down her shears and wiped her hands on her apron. "Good morning, Mr. Spencer," she greeted him politely. "Good morning, Emily," Richard replied, his tone measured. "I'd like to speak with you in my office. There's an important matter I'd like to discuss." Emily's brow furrowed slightly, but she nodded. "Of course, sir. Just let me finish up here." "Take your time," Richard said, his mind racing with how best to present his proposal. A few minutes later, Emily entered Richard's office, her posture straight, but her expression curious and cautious. Richard gestured to a chair opposite his desk. "Please have a seat," he said. Emily sat down, folding her hands in her lap. "What is it you wanted to discuss, Mr. Spencer?" Richard took a moment to gather his thoughts, then began, "Emily, I've noticed the dedication and hard work you bring to your job. It's commendable and quite rare these days." "Thank you, sir," Emily replied, a hint of confusion in her voice. "I try to do my best." Richard nodded. "I believe you can help me with a very personal matter. It's about my son, Ethan." Emily's eyes widened slightly, but she remained silent, waiting for him to continue. "You may have noticed that Ethan has been struggling," Richard said carefully. "His behavior has become increasingly reckless and irresponsible. I fear for his future and the future of our family business." Emily nodded, though she said nothing. Richard could see she was trying to understand where this conversation was leading. "I've come to a rather unconventional solution," Richard continued. "I'd like to propose an arrangement, a marriage between you and Ethan." Emily blinked, clearly taken aback. "A marriage?" she repeated, her voice tinged with disbelief. "Yes," Richard said, leaning forward slightly. "I believe that your influence could help guide Ethan back to a more responsible path. In return, I would ensure that your mother receives the best medical care available and that your educational aspirations are fully funded." Emily sat back in her chair, her mind racing. The offer was overwhelming and the implications enormous. She thought of her mother, whose medical bills were piling up, and her own dreams of further education that seemed increasingly out of reach. I don't know what to say," Emily finally managed. "I understand this is a lot to take in," Richard said gently. "Please take your time to consider it. I know it's an unusual request, but I truly believe it could benefit both you and Ethan." Emily looked down at her hands, her thoughts a whirlwind of emotions and questions. The proposal was beyond anything she could have imagined, and yet the potential benefits were undeniable. But could she really marry a man she barely knew, let alone one with Ethan's reputation? "May I have some time to think about it?" she asked quietly. "Of course," Richard replied. "Take all the time you need. This is a significant decision, and I want you to be sure." Emily nodded, her mind still spinning. She stood up, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on her shoulders. As she left Richard's office, she couldn't help but glance back, seeing the seriousness in his eyes. This was not just a proposition, it was a plea for help, a father's last hope to save his son. Returning to the garden, Emily resumed her work, but her thoughts were far from the flowers and hedges. She knew she had to make a choice, and it would be one that could change her life forever. Emily Thompson sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a steaming mug of tea. Across from her, her mother, Jane, looked at her with concern. The small, cozy kitchen was filled with the soft hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the old wooden chairs. "Emily, are you sure about this?" Jane asked, her voice gentle but firm. Emily took a deep breath, meeting her mother's eyes. "I've thought about it a lot, Mom. Mr. Spencer's offer it's a lifeline for us. Your medical bills, my education. This could change everything." Jane reached out, placing a hand over Emily's. "I know, sweetheart, but marriage to a man like Ethan Spencer? You barely know him, and what you do know isn't exactly reassuring." Emily sighed, looking down at her tea. "I know Ethan's reputation, but Mr. Spencer believes I can help him, and in return, we get the support we desperately need. It's not ideal, but it's a chance I'm willing to take." Jane squeezed her daughter's hand. "You've always been so strong, Emily. You've made so many sacrifices already. If you believe this is the right choice, then I support you. Just promise me you'll take care of yourself." Emily nodded, a determined look in her eyes. "I promise, Mom." The next day, Emily found herself back in Richard Spencer's office. The room was filled with an air of formality as Richard looked up from his desk. "Have you made your decision, Emily?" he asked. She took a deep breath. "Yes, Mr. Spencer. I'll marry Ethan." Richard's expression softened with relief. "Thank you, Emily. I know this isn't easy, but I believe it's the right step for both of you." Meanwhile, Ethan Spencer lounged on the couch in the living room, nursing a hangover from the previous night's escapades. He glanced up as his father entered the room, a serious look on his face. "Ethan, we need to talk," Richard said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Ethan groaned, sitting up. "What now, Dad? Another lecture?" "This is important," Richard replied, taking a seat across from him. "I've arranged for you to marry Emily Thompson." Ethan blinked, disbelief washing over his features. "You did what?" "You heard me," Richard said calmly. "Emily will be your wife. This arrangement will help you both." Ethan laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "You can't be serious. I'm not marrying some gardener." "This isn't up for debate," Richard said, his voice firm. "This is happening, and you will respect her." Ethan's eyes narrowed, anger simmering beneath the surface. "This is ridiculous. You can't control my life like this." "Maybe not," Richard replied, standing up. "But I can control your access to your inheritance and your place in this family. It's time you start taking responsibility." Ethan stood up as well, his fists clenched. "This isn't fair." "Life rarely is," Richard said quietly. "But this is necessary and more argue, go back and ready for meeting." The first meeting between Ethan and Emily was arranged for the following day. Emily stood in the elegant drawing room of the Spencer mansion, feeling out of place amidst the opulence. She smoothed her skirt nervously, her eyes fixed on the door. Ethan entered the room with a swagger, his expression one of disdain. He barely glanced at Emily as he walked in, his body language screaming defiance. "Emily," Richard said, standing between them, "this is Ethan." Ethan finally looked at her, his gaze cool and appraising. "So, you're the one my father's decided to shackle me to?" Emily met his gaze steadily, refusing to be intimidated. "I'm Emily Thompson. It's nice to meet you, Ethan." Ethan snorted, turning to his father. "Nice choice, Dad. Very practical." Richard's eyes flashed with warning. "Ethan, I expect you to treat Emily with respect." "Sure, whatever," Ethan muttered, looking away. Emily took a deep breath, maintaining her composure. "I understand this is difficult for both of us, but I believe we can make this work if we try." Ethan's eyes narrowed as he looked at her. "Try all you want. I'm not interested in playing house." Richard intervened, his tone authoritative. "This arrangement is happening, Ethan. The sooner you accept it, the better it will be for everyone." Ethan's jaw clenched, but he said nothing more. The room fell into an uncomfortable silence, the tension palpable. As the meeting concluded, Emily walked out of the room, her heart heavy, but her resolve intact. She knew this journey would be challenging, but she was determined to see it through, for her mother's sake and her own. Ethan's dismissive attitude was just another hurdle she would have to overcome, and she was no stranger to hard work. A few weeks later, the wedding took place on a crisp autumn afternoon, the sun casting a golden glow over the small chapel nestled at the edge of Crestwood. Inside, the atmosphere was intimate, attended only by immediate family and a few close friends. The modest guest list was a stark contrast to the usual grandeur associated with the Spencer name, a sign of the unusual circumstances surrounding the union. Emily stood at the altar, her heart pounding beneath the simple white dress she had chosen. She glanced at Ethan, who looked as if he would rather be anywhere else. His jaw was clenched, and he avoided her gaze, his discomfort palpable. Richard Spencer, standing proudly beside his son, gave a supportive nod to Emily. She forced a smile, trying to steady her nerves. As the officiant began the ceremony, Emily's mind wandered. She felt a mixture of hope and apprehension. This marriage was a lifeline for her mother's health and her future, but it also meant tying her life to a man who clearly resented the arrangement. Ethan's responses during the vows were curt, his tone lacking any warmth. When it came time for the rings, he slipped the band onto Emily's finger with a detached air, barely looking at her. Emily, in contrast, placed the ring on Ethan's finger with a steady hand, her eyes searching his for any sign of softening. The ceremony concluded with a brief kiss, more a formality than a gesture of affection. As they walked back down the aisle, Emily felt the weight of her new reality settle over her. She was now Mrs. Ethan Spencer, for better or worse. Life in the Spencer mansion quickly fell into a routine that highlighted the vast differences between the newlyweds. Emily rose early each morning, her day starting with a run through the estate gardens. She found solace in the familiar tasks of gardening, her hands working the soil as she planned her next steps. Ethan, on the other hand, slept late, often not emerging until noon. His nights were filled with parties and outings, his friends a constant presence in the mansion. Emily would hear their laughter and loud conversations late into the night, a sharp reminder of the world Ethan inhabited. Their interactions were minimal and often strained. At breakfast, Emily would greet Ethan with a polite, "Good morning," to which he would respond with a grunt, his attention focused on his phone. The staff, accustomed to Ethan's ways, treated Emily with a mix of curiosity and respect, recognizing her as a hard worker but unsure of her place in the household hierarchy. One evening, as Emily was preparing dinner, Ethan stumbled into the kitchen with a few of his friends. They were loud, their speech slurred from too many drinks. One of Ethan's friends, a tall man with a sneer permanently etched on his face, looked Emily up and down. "So, this is the new Mrs. Spencer," he drawled. "Quite a change from the usual company, Ethan." Emily felt a flush rise to her cheeks but kept her composure. "Can I help you with something?" she asked evenly. The man laughed. "Just observing the domestic bliss. Tell me, how does it feel to marry into money?" Ethan, leaning against the counter, said nothing, his eyes fixed on a spot on the floor. Emily's heart sank at his silence. "I didn't marry for money," she replied, her voice steady. "I married to help my family." The man raised an eyebrow. "How noble," he said sarcastically. "Well, good luck with that." Ethan finally looked up, a hint of annoyance in his eyes. "That's enough, Mark," he muttered. Mark smirked, but backed off, the damage done. Ethan's friends soon left the kitchen, leaving Emily feeling more isolated than ever. She turned back to her task, her mind racing. The tension between her and Ethan was growing, fueled by his friends' mocking and his unwillingness to defend her. That night, as Emily lay in bed, she couldn't shake the feeling of being an outsider in her own home. She knew the road ahead would be challenging, but she was determined to make the best of it, for her mother's sake and for her own. Ethan's late-night return woke her from a restless sleep. She heard him stumble into his room, the door closing with a soft click. Emily stared at the ceiling, wondering if they would ever find common ground. The differences between them were vast, but she held onto a sliver of hope that things might change. Early morning next day, Ethan stood on the patio, nursing a cup of coffee as he gazed out at the sprawling gardens of the Spencer estate. The early morning sun cast a golden hue over the landscape, making everything look almost surreal. His eyes wandered to the far end of the garden where Emily was hard at work, her movements fluid and purposeful. For reasons he couldn't quite pinpoint, he found himself watching her more frequently these days. He had always dismissed the garden as just another part of the estate, a place that looked good for parties and gatherings. But watching Emily work, he saw something different. There was a rhythm to her actions, a kind of dedication that he found intriguing. She seemed to find solace among the flowers and plants, her face calm and focused. Ethan sipped his coffee, his thoughts drifting. Why did she work so hard? What drove her to spend hours tending to the garden with such care? He shook his head, as if to clear it. It was none of his business. Yet he couldn't deny the growing curiosity. Later that day, Ethan wandered into the garden, feigning casual interest. Emily was kneeling by a bed of roses, carefully pruning the bushes. She looked up as he approached, a hint of surprise in her eyes. "Hey," he said, stuffing his hands into his pockets. "Hi," she replied, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "What brings you out here?" Ethan shrugged. "Just thought I'd take a look around. The garden looks nice." Emily smiled, a small, genuine smile that reached her eyes. He nodded, feeling a bit awkward. "Need any help?" She looked at him, assessing whether his offer was sincere. "Sure. Could you hand me those shears?" Ethan hesitated for a moment, then picked up the shears and handed them to her. She showed him how to trim the roses, her instructions clear and patient. He followed her lead, feeling a strange sense of satisfaction as the unruly branches gave way to neat, orderly shapes. "This isn't so bad," he admitted, more to himself than to her. Emily glanced at him, her expression thoughtful. "It can be quite therapeutic, actually. You get to see the results of your work almost immediately." Ethan nodded, continuing to prune the roses. The work required focus, and, for a while, it silenced the noise in his mind. They worked in companionable silence, the only sounds the snip of the shears and the rustle of leaves. As the days passed, Ethan found himself joining Emily in the garden more often. It started with simple tasks, handing her tools, carrying bags of soil, but gradually he took on more responsibilities. He was surprised to find that he enjoyed it. The physical labor was a welcome change from the aimlessness of his previous days. One afternoon, as they worked side by side, Ethan spoke up. "You really know your stuff, don't you?" Emily looked at him, a hint of a smile on her lips. "I've been doing this for a long time. My father taught me everything I know about gardening." He nodded, genuinely impressed. "It shows. This place looks amazing." "Thank you," she said softly. "It means a lot to hear that." Their conversations grew more frequent and less guarded. Emily shared stories about her family, her dreams, and her struggles. Ethan listened, finding her openness refreshing. In return, he began to open up as well, sharing parts of his life he rarely talked about. Through these interactions, Ethan's respect for Emily deepened. Her dedication and work ethic were qualities he had rarely encountered in his social circles. She was kind and patient, never complaining, even when the work was tough. One evening, as they stood together, surveying the day's work, Ethan turned to Emily. "I've learned a lot from you, you know?" She looked at him, her expression curious. "Like what?" "Like the importance of hard work," he said slowly. "And patience. You've taught me more than you realize." Emily smiled, a genuine, warm smile that made something inside Ethan shift. "I'm glad to hear that. You've come a long way, Ethan." He nodded, feeling a sense of accomplishment he hadn't felt in a long time. "Thanks to you." As the sun set, casting a warm glow over the garden, Ethan realized that his curiosity had grown into something more. Emily's influence was changing him, breaking through the walls of arrogance and indifference he had built around himself. Ethan Spencer found himself spending more time in the garden than he ever imagined. The garden had become a sanctuary, a place where he could clear his mind and find a semblance of peace. Emily was often by his side, her presence both comforting and inspiring. They worked together, their hands deep in the soil, cultivating not just the plants, but also a growing understanding between them. Their conversations during these times were gradually becoming more personal. Ethan learned about Emily's dreams of furthering her education, her deep love for her family, and the sacrifices she had made to support them. In turn, Ethan shared his frustrations with the expectations placed upon him, his sense of inadequacy, and his desire to find his own path. Each exchange brought them closer, revealing layers of their personalities that had remained hidden. One evening, as they sat on the patio after a long day, Ethan looked at Emily with a newfound respect. "You know, you've taught me a lot about hard work," he said, breaking the comfortable silence. Emily smiled, her eyes reflecting the fading light. "It's not just about working hard, Ethan. It's about finding meaning in what you do." Ethan nodded thoughtfully. "I think I'm starting to understand that. I've even started taking on some responsibilities at the company." Dad was surprised, to say the least. Emily's smile widened. "That's great, Ethan. I'm sure he's proud of you." Ethan shrugged, though he couldn't hide a small, satisfied grin. "It's a start." As the days went by, Ethan's commitment to learning the family business grew. He spent hours at the office, poring over documents, attending meetings, and trying to absorb as much as he could. It was exhausting work, but he was determined to prove himself, to his father, to Emily, and to himself. However, the pressure began to build. The weight of his new responsibilities was heavier than he had anticipated. One night, after a particularly grueling day, Ethan found himself at a bar with his old friends. He hadn't planned on going out, but the need to escape, even for a little while, was overwhelming. "Man, you've changed," Mark said, clapping Ethan on the back as they sat down with their drinks. "Who knew you'd turn into such a workaholic?" Ethan laughed, though it was tinged with frustration. "Yeah, well, trying to turn over a new leaf, I guess. Or maybe trying to impress someone," another friend teased, raising an eyebrow. Ethan's smile faltered. "It's not like that." "Oh, come on," Mark said, smirking. "We all know it's about that gardener of yours. What's her name? Emily?" Ethan felt a flush of irritation. "Leave her out of this." Mark raised his hands in mock surrender. All right. But seriously, man, you need to loosen up. One night of fun won't kill you." Ethan hesitated, the pressure of the past weeks weighing heavily on his mind. He knew he should go home, get some rest, and be ready for the next day. But the jibes and the stress were pushing him toward a decision he would soon regret. "Fine," he said, signaling the bartender for another round. "One night." Hours passed in a blur of laughter, music, and drinks. Ethan's initial reservations melted away, replaced by a temporary sense of relief. It felt good to let go, to forget the burdens of responsibility, even if just for a night. But as the night wore on, the effects of the alcohol deepened, and with it, a sense of guilt began to creep in. He thought of Emily, of the progress he had made, and a part of him knew this was a mistake. Yet, the combination of peer pressure and the desire to escape was too strong. The clock struck midnight as Ethan stumbled into the mansion, the remnants of the night's revelry clinging to him like a second skin. The party had been a blur of loud music, laughter, and too many drinks. His friends had convinced him to join them, promising it would be just like old times. For a while, it was. Ethan's steps were uneven as he made his way through the dimly lit hallways. He hadn't expected to find Emily waiting for him in the living room, her arms crossed and a look of profound disappointment etched on her face. "Ethan," she said quietly, her voice tinged with a mix of worry and frustration. He froze, caught off guard. "Emily, what are you doing up?" "I could ask you the same thing," she replied, her eyes searching his. "You promised you were done with this." Ethan ran a hand through his hair, avoiding her gaze. "It was just a party. No big deal." "No big deal?" Emily's voice rose, her composure slipping. "You come home drunk in the middle of the night and you think it's no big deal?" He frowned, the alcohol dulling his ability to respond thoughtfully. "I needed a break. It's been stressful, and they're my friends." "Friends who don't care about the changes you're trying to make," Emily shot back. "Do you think they're the ones who will be there for you when things get tough? Because I've been here, supporting you, believing in you." Ethan felt a pang of guilt, but his pride kept him from admitting it. "I don't need a lecture, Emily. I can handle myself." Emily took a step closer, her eyes welling up with unshed tears. "Can you? Because right now, it feels like I'm the only one who cares about your future." "Maybe I don't want you to care so much," Ethan snapped, the words out before he could stop them. Emily recoiled as if struck, her face crumpling. "Is that how you really feel?" The silence that followed was heavy, each second stretching painfully. Ethan watched as Emily's expression hardened, her tears now flowing freely. "You know what, Ethan? I've given everything to support you, to help you become the man I know you can be. But if this is how you want to live your life, I can't stand by and watch you throw it all away." Her voice broke, but she continued, her determination shining through. "I love you, Ethan, but I won't let you drag me down with you." With that, she turned and walked out of the room, leaving Ethan standing there, the full weight of her words sinking in. He heard her retreating footsteps and the soft click of her bedroom door closing. The house fell into a heavy silence, broken only by the ticking of the old grandfather clock in the hallway. Ethan sank into a chair, his head in his hands. The anger that had flared up during their argument dissipated, replaced by a crushing sense of regret. He had hurt Emily, the one person who had believed in him when no one else did. His mind replayed the night's events, the carefree laughter of his friends, the clinking of glasses, and his own careless words. How had he allowed himself to fall back into old habits so easily? Emily's disappointment was a sharp reminder of how much he had changed and how far he still had to go. Ethan stood up and walked slowly to his room, each step heavy with the realization of his mistakes. He paused outside Emily's door, hearing the faint sound of her crying. It tore at him, knowing he was the cause of her pain. He wanted to knock, to apologize, but he knew she needed space. Inside his room, Ethan sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the wall. The room felt cold and empty, mirroring the hollowness inside him. He thought about Emily, her unwavering support, her patience, and her love. She had stood by him, believing in his potential, even when he didn't believe in himself. Tears of his own began to fall as he realized just how much he valued her, how much he needed her in his life. The thought of losing her was unbearable. He had to make things right, not just for her, but for himself. He couldn't go back to the person he was before. As the night wore on, Ethan made a silent vow. He would earn back Emily's trust and respect. He would prove to her and to himself that he was capable of change. It wouldn't be easy, but he was determined to fight for their future. In her room, Emily lay awake, tears still streaming down her face. She felt a mix of heartache and resolve. Despite the pain, she knew she had to stand firm. She loved Ethan, but she couldn't let him pull her into his downward spiral. The morning after the confrontation, Ethan woke with a heavy heart. The weight of his actions and Emily's disappointment pressed down on him. Determined to make things right, he found Emily in the garden, tending to her beloved roses. She looked up as he approached, her expression wary. "Emily, can we talk?" he asked, his voice earnest. She nodded, setting down her shears. "Okay, let's talk." Ethan took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts. "I'm sorry for last night. I know I let you down, and I know I've been slipping back into old habits." Emily's eyes softened, but she remained silent, waiting for him to continue. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said," Ethan continued. "About needing to be all in, about this being a pattern. You're right. I can't keep making excuses. I need to change." Emily sighed, her shoulders relaxing slightly. "Ethan, I believe you can change. I've seen glimpses of the person you can be, but you need to want it for yourself, not just for me or your father." "I do want it," Ethan said, his voice firm. "I want to be the person you believe I can be. I want to be worthy of your trust." Emily looked at him, her eyes searching his. "I want to believe you, Ethan, but actions speak louder than words. Show me you're serious." Ethan nodded, determination shining in his eyes. "I will. I promise." Over the next few weeks, Ethan threw himself into his work at the family business. He took on more responsibilities, learning the ins and outs of the operations. Richard watched with a mixture of surprise and pride as Ethan handled tasks with a newfound sense of dedication and efficiency. One afternoon, Richard called Ethan into his office. "You've been doing good work, Ethan," he said, his tone approving. "I can see you're serious about making a change." Ethan nodded, feeling a sense of accomplishment. "Thanks, Dad. I'm trying my best." Richard smiled, a rare show of emotion. "Keep it up. You're on the right path. Meanwhile, Ethan and Emily found themselves working together on a project to revitalize the estate's greenhouse. The work was demanding, but it provided them with a shared goal and an opportunity to strengthen their bond. As they arranged new plants and repaired old structures, their conversations flowed more easily. They talked about their dreams, their fears, and the challenges they faced. Through these moments, Ethan's respect for Emily deepened, and he found himself opening up in ways he never had before. Their partnership extended beyond the garden. At a charity event hosted by the Spencer family, Ethan found himself in a familiar social setting. The room was filled with influential guests, and Ethan felt a pang of anxiety. But this time, he wasn't alone. As they mingled with the guests, a comment from one of Ethan's old friends reached his ears. "So Ethan, still playing house with the gardener?" The remark was laced with sarcasm, drawing laughter from a few nearby. Ethan felt a flash of anger, but remained composed. He stepped closer to Emily, placing a protective hand on her shoulder. "Emily is my wife," he said firmly, his voice carrying through the room. "And she's more than earned my respect. If you can't see that, then maybe it's time you rethink your priorities." The room fell silent, the weight of Ethan's words sinking in. Emily looked up at him, her eyes shining with gratitude and pride. It was a public declaration of his commitment, a clear sign of his growth. Later that night, as they returned to the mansion, Emily turned to Ethan. "Thank you for standing up for me," she said softly. Ethan smiled, his heart swelling with emotion. "You've stood by me through everything. It's the least I could do. I love you." And then, immediately, Ethan kissed Emily under the star night. As they walked through the garden hand in hand, Ethan realized how much his life had changed. Not just in his actions, but in his heart. He knew the journey ahead would still have its challenges, but with Emily by his side, he felt ready to face anything. The Spencer garden was in full bloom, the vibrant colors of the flowers contrasting beautifully with the deep green of the leaves. A warm evening, and the setting sun cast a golden hue over everything, creating an almost magical atmosphere. Ethan had chosen this moment carefully. The garden had become a symbol of their journey, a place where they had grown together. Emily was kneeling by the rose bushes, her hands gently tending to the flowers. Ethan watched her for a moment, taking in the serenity of the scene. His heart pounded with a mix of excitement and nerves. He approached her slowly, clearing his throat to catch her attention. "Emily," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. She looked up, a smile spreading across her face. "Ethan, what is it?" He took a deep breath and reached into his pocket, pulling out a small velvet box. "There's something I've been meaning to ask you." Emily's eyes widened as she stood up, her hands instinctively covering her mouth. Ethan got down on one knee, holding the box out to her. "Emily, you've been my rock, my guide, and my inspiration. You've shown me what it means to love and to be loved. Will you marry me for real this time? Not out of obligation, but out of genuine love and commitment." Tears welled up in Emily's eyes as she nodded, her voice choked with emotion. "Yes, Ethan. Yes, I will." Ethan slipped the ring onto her finger, a perfect fit. They embraced, the garden around them a witness to their love and the promise of a new beginning. Over the next few days, their conversations were filled with plans for the future. They sat together on the patio, discussing their dreams and aspirations, their hands entwined. "I've been thinking," Ethan said one evening, "about starting a charity, something to help underprivileged kids get an education. I know how much your mum's support meant to you, and I want to give others that same chance." Emily's face lit up. "That's a wonderful idea, Ethan. I can help with the organization and planning. And maybe we can incorporate some environmental education too, teach them about gardening and sustainability." Ethan nodded, his heart swelling with pride and love. "I love that. It's perfect. And for the business, I want to continue the work we've started in the greenhouse, expand it, make it a part of the community." Emily squeezed his hand. "I'm with you all the way. Whatever we do it together." Their shared dreams began to take shape, and their bond grew stronger with each passing day. They worked side by side, their efforts aligned towards a common goal. A few months later, the Spencer estate hosted a family gathering. The air was filled with laughter and the aroma of delicious food. Friends and family mingled, enjoying the warm summer day. Richard stood by the grill, flipping burgers, a rare smile on his face. Ethan and Emily moved through the crowd, greeting guests and sharing their plans. The guests included those who had once doubted their relationship, now seeing the genuine connection and respect between them. At one point, Ethan's old friend Mark approached them, a hesitant smile on his face. "Ethan, Emily, can we talk?" Ethan exchanged a glance with Emily, then nodded. "Sure, Mark. What's up?" Mark rubbed the back of his neck, looking slightly uncomfortable. "I owe you both an apology. I was wrong about you, Emily, and I was wrong about this whole thing. You've changed, Ethan, and it's clear it's for the better. I'm happy for you guys." Emily smiled warmly. "Thank you, Mark. That means a lot." Ethan clapped Mark on the shoulder. As the evening progressed, Ethan and Emily found a moment to themselves, standing at the edge of the garden. The setting sun painted the sky with hues of pink and orange, casting a soft glow over the flowers. Emily leaned into Ethan, her head resting on his shoulder. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" Ethan nodded, his arm around her waist. "We have, and I wouldn't have it any other way." They stood there, surrounded by the beauty of the garden, reflecting on their journey. From a marriage of convenience to a partnership built on love and respect, they had faced challenges and grown together. Their future was bright, filled with shared dreams and the promise of new beginnings. As the first stars appeared in the twilight sky, Ethan whispered, "Here's to us, Emily. To everything we've been through and everything that's yet to come." Emily smiled, her heart full. "To us, Ethan, forever and always." Hey everyone, thank you so much for tuning in to this heartfelt chapter of Ethan and Emily's journey. It's been an incredible experience diving into their world, watching Ethan's transformation and the challenges he faces along the way. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more compelling content. I love sharing these deep, emotional narratives that remind us of the power of growth and resilience. Don't forget to leave a comment below about what you think Ethan should do next to make things right with Emily. I love hearing your thoughts and theories. And remember, every step we take, even the mistakes, can lead us to become better versions of ourselves. Stay tuned for the next chapter where we'll see how Ethan continues his journey towards redemption and how Emily's influence shapes his path. Thank you for being such an amazing community. Until next time, stay inspired, stay motivated, and keep embracing the stories that touch your heart. See you in the next video.